Hello, everyone. Hello, good morning. My name is Jeffrey Uslip. I'm the Deputy Director for Exhibitions and Programs and Chief Curator here at CAM. Thank you for joining us this morning to hear our panel discussion with the artists and the jurors from the latest iteration of the Great Rivers Biennial, which opened to the public last night. Now in its 7th iteration, the Great Rivers Biennial is a collaborative initiative between CAM and the Gateway Foundation, which identifies talented, mid-career, and emerging artists working in the greater St. Louis metropolitan area and awards 3 artists with $20,000 and a major exhibition at CAM. So first, we'd like to thank the Gateway Foundation for this incredible support and their steadfast commitment to local artists and really to help realize this important exhibition every other summer. I'd also like to thank our staff at CAM for working so diligently and so tirelessly to bring this exhibition to fruition. For each Great Rivers Biennial, CAM invites an outside panel of 3 distinguished jurors to review artist applications and select 3 winners. This year, we expanded the selection process and asked jurors to first select 10 finalists from over the 80 submissions, and then travel to St. Louis and conduct studio visits with the artists. And it really was an incredible opportunity for the jurors to see the artists, to be in their studio, to have one-on-one contact, and really create a situation where they could ask questions, understand their practice, and have a better sense of what was going to be here at CAM. And because the overall look of the biennial and the conceptual matrix and evaluative criteria is really on the onus of the jurors, for us at CAM, it was important to select the most innovative, radical, and diverse curators and practitioners working in the field to really take this litmus test in terms of what was happening in St. Louis at that time. And so with that, I would first like to introduce our incredible jurors to my left. Ellegood, who is the Senior Curator at the Hammer Museum. Valerie Cassel Oliver is the Senior Curator at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston. And Paul Pfeiffer is a renowned sculptor, photographer, and video artist. So first, Anne. Anne is the Senior Curator at the Hammer Museum. Prior to joining the Hammer, Ellegood was the Curator of Contemporary Art at the Hirshhorn Museum and Sculpture Garden in Washington, D.C., from 2005 to 2009. After that, she served as the she has also served as the New York-based curator for the Peter Norton collection of over 2,400 works of international contemporary art, and as the associate curator at the New Museum of Contemporary Art in New York. Recently, she curated the exhibitions Take It or Leave It, Institution, Image, and Ideology in 2014, co-organized with Johanna Burton, which explored the overlapping strategies of appropriation and institutional critique in American art. Black Forest, an exhibition of the work of Kelly Nipper, the Hammer Invitational, All of This and Nothing, and the Hammer's first biennial of Los Angeles-based artists Made in LA 2012, which included the work of 60 artists working in a wide range of mediums. Ellegood was selected by the Australian Council for the Arts to curate the Pavilion in 2011, and is currently working on exhibitions of the work of Kevin Beasley and John Outerbridge, as well as the first North American retrospective of the work of Jimmy Durham, which is incredible. And we are very much looking forward to that show. And that show is scheduled to open at the Hammer in 2017. Ellegood has contributed text to numerous journals, including Art Forum, Tate, Moose, The Exhibitionist, and has written numerous catalog essays on artists ranging from Charles Gaines to Sarah Vanderbeek, among others. Thank you, Anne. Valerie Cassel Oliver is the Senior Curator at the Contemporary Art Museum in Houston. In 2014, she opened a major traveling survey of drawings by the Houston-based and internationally recognized artist Trenton Doyle Hancock, entitled Skin and Bones, 20 Years of Drawing. In 2012, she mounted the project Radical Presence, Black Performance in Contemporary Art, currently touring through, well, it was touring through 2015. Cassel Oliver has organized numerous other exhibitions, including a survey of Donald Moffat, The Extravagant Vein, a major retrospective on Benjamin Patterson, and has curated really groundbreaking exhibitions, Cinema Remixed and Reloaded, Black Women Artists and the Moving Image, Black Light, White Noise. It's really, she is one of the kind of key artists that we think about, and of course, the acclaimed Double Consciousness, Black Conceptual Art since 1970. Prior to her tenure at CAM Houston, she was the director of the Visiting Artist Program at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and in 2000, she was one of the 6 curators selected to organize the biennial for the Whitney Museum of American Art. Paul Pfeiffer is a renowned sculptor, photographer, and video artist. He lives and works in New York and now Georgia. Often appropriating footage from such public sporting events as professional basketball and hockey games, Pfeiffer uses recent computer technologies to examine the role that mass media plays in shaping human consciousness. His work is represented in numerous collections, including the Guggenheim, the MCA Chicago, the Hirshhorn, the Broad. He is the recipient of several awards and fellowships, including a fellowship at the American Academy in Berlin. He was awarded the Buxbaum Award from the Whitney. And in 2003, there was a traveling retrospective of his work, which was organized by the Massachusetts Institute of Technology's List Visual Arts Center and the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And so now we will introduce the 3 winners. So thank you, jurors. First, we have Lyndon Barrois Jr., whose multidisciplinary practice includes installation, painting, and sculpture, and he's questioning aesthetic value, race, and representation. His Great Rivers Biennial installation of color situates 8 life-size assemblages composed of Xerox toner boxes and cropped images of athletes, fashion models, and domestic objects. And he asks viewers to consider how cultures, people, lifestyle, how these images traffic in shifting media and cultural and social contexts. Nanette Boileau bases her practice on the vast territory of the Louisiana Purchase. She's created nuanced portraits of the contemporary American West. Filmed over the course of several months, her 3-channel video titled Dakota Territory presents a series of scenes or field notes that examine the quotidian life of ranchers in southeastern Wyoming and the Black Hills of South Dakota. And finally, Tate Foley's exhibition Post No Bills presents large-scale structures and a 12 single-channel video piece that reframes the language of protest by presenting a series of words spelled phonetically. We are asked to interrogate the impact of prescribed definitions and construct nuanced meanings from these often essentializing terms. So this is a really, really incredible group here. And so I thought we would start with the jurors. So since, exactly, good luck. Since the onus is, as we said, really on you, I mean, you were the group that looked through these 80 applications, you reviewed what was happening on the ground, and I was curious, what was your evaluative criteria? What were you looking for when you sat down to see who is in St. Louis, who would be the right artist for this project? What were you looking for?
You want me to go? You're closest to him. I guess we're going across the table. Can you hear me? Okay. Well, so you're talking about the first 80 applicants.
Exactly.
To narrow it down to 10. Well, that's always quite a endeavor, as you can imagine. Spending several hours looking through artist materials, that aren't the artwork itself, which always has its limitations. So you have to, use your best way of, kind of thinking through what this work would actually look like in person. And to be fair, I do think that some artists' work it reproduces better for these types of situations. But That said, of course, the most important criteria is artwork that you feel is really compelling in some way. And I think for me, I'm usually looking for some combination of a kind of adeptness with materials, and also a reasoning behind the type of materials that the artist is choosing. So I always think about the fact that artists have these choices, and in those choices are sort of conceptual and even sometimes ideological aspects to the choices that they make. So thinking through the choices they've made and what kind of argument or what kind of position they're trying to stake through them. So it's really a balance of an adeptness with their material and with their medium, and then also something that, you know, as a viewer, I can sort of sink my teeth into and think about. And I think that that's sort of the key for me, that it compels me to think through something. So in the case of, I mean, I will say I was just generally very impressed with the artists that we looked at. And, you know, certainly when we narrowed it down to 10 and visited the studios, it was a real pleasure. I mean, for a curator to come from another city and come somewhere and really get a sense of what's happening in the region, I think is quite meaningful, especially because we still live in a country where we tend to think that the art centers are fairly limited to New York and Los Angeles, and I really, while those cities are obviously incredibly important and prominent, that there's a lot of great things happening elsewhere. So it's a real pleasure, and I want to thank you guys for bringing us out here. But, you know, bottom line is you're looking for a good artist, and also and I think collectively, we were looking for artists who were, in a way, at a particular moment, or I was, in their careers, where you felt that this award would propel them forward, but also that they were ready for that. And I think, you know, in meeting the artists, that's where you can sort of figure out that they are ready and eager and capable of really pushing themselves and making something great. And I think that definitely happened with these three.
Oh, you've
Did I already say it all?
You've said quite a bit, and I would second all that Anne has said, in the sense that you are looking for a particular skill set, an adeptness, a use of material, an intentionality that's there, but then also someone who is willing to push the materials even further and up to and beyond its own limitations, you know, just based on a particular point of view and an ideology. And I think having a way to articulate what one wants to say, having the skill sets to do that. Oftentimes, you know, for me, there's always a wild card that's thrown into the 10 when you know you're visiting studios. It is a curiosity because a lot of people's work does not translate very well within modes of applications and submissions. But I will say that everyone we visited really were compelling in their own right. And to me, with the world sort of becoming much smaller through the World Wide Web and travel, I don't really think of things in terms of regionalism, but I do think that there are things that come out of place that are very significant. And of course, we came to visit in 2015, which was the direct aftermath of Ferguson. And there were things that I know for me that were in my mind, in my headspace. And so, not that that really directed a path, but you know, it's always compelling to me to see that artists are permeable, that they're not hermetically sealed in a studio, that the artist is actually a citizen of the world, and they use their work, some cases, not in all cases, to be very reflexive to the world around them. And so being able to speak to place, I think, was important to me specifically, and just the fact that people are very reflexive in their practice as well. Maybe not about certain issues, but about the world around them. So I think that.
Definitely. I don't have so much to add. I definitely agree with everything that was already said, and yeah, I think maybe partially because of my own interest in video as a medium for art making, I would say I was thinking coming here, definitely I also feel like the same criteria applied here is what I would apply if I was doing a similar looking in New York or anywhere else. To me, it's really a time when the world is very small. And so one thing that I was thinking about and that I feel that we really talked a lot about is that the biennial and this museum is a public stage. And so the artists that were selected were also selected because we thought that they were ready and had something important to contribute to the public discourse about art and about the contemporary world in general. So I feel like I was always thinking about, or I always think about what an artist brings to their material and what their ideas are that they're bringing to the table. And I'm also thinking about how artists generally think of their relationship to the media. The media being the mass media, and I would include everything from television and cable to the World Wide Web, really just the larger context of the circulation of information today. I feel like it's so crucially important. It has a leveling effect, and it has a complicating effect. You know, there's a way that information is deployed in the world today on all levels, politically and economically and so forth. And whether we like it or not, we are all engaging with that machine. So I consider artists to be, in a way, like very important players in this regard because we are makers and creating, playing with the media.
Absolutely. I mean, it really seems like every time we approach a biennial of any kind or an exhibition of this nature, it is so much about timing. The applications that really came to the fore, and I really had the privilege of kind of being a fly on the wall through this process and sort of listening to, facilitating sort of the 80 and listening to the jurors think through who they were going to visit. And, one thing that was really compelling, and I knew immediately we made the right selection on jurors, is that you really always had an attention to how materials make meaning and how these submissions are very much coming out of their time here in St. Louis. And that was something that, I was very attuned to, and I think you did a really great job with that. And I think hearing you say that is really important. The work of art was always the work of philosophy for you, and how those artists were thinking about their practices and how they were using materials, how they were responding to the landscape of St. Louis really came to the fore, for sure. And so now I think we should turn to the artists and ask them, what surprised you? How did your exhibition for you and your way of thinking develop over the course of, these 9 months after the jurors came to your studio, after they selected you, after I received those names? How did the process unfold for you? What were you surprised by? And was your original proposal for you what you articulated here at CAM? Let's start with Lyndon.
You're going to be second.
Can I be heard? I'm a mumbler. I think that for the most part, what's there is what I set out to do. The foundation of it, the fact that there was going to be a court place and there were going to be objects exhibited on it, remained consistent. What I didn't know was what the objects would actually look like, what they would be made of. I knew it was going to be a combination of image and object, or images acting as objects, but I didn't know exactly how they would be composed. So for me, it was kind of this roller coaster, because I knew that the court wasn't going to be something that I would necessarily be making or manufacturing in my studio. I know that had to be something real. And then, so like the actual objects was like a very impulsive and kind of winding road of sort of finding the form. And that only came out of actually working on other things leading up to working on this work. Because I had a very different idea for what these were going to be that got scrapped, like in the winter. And it was only from like thanks to Jeffrey of like seeing this other work that I was like, you know, I had this idea, it wasn't working out, but I've been doing this in the meantime, and he was like, yeah, run with that. So what we see now is like the first example of me taking like something that I'm tinkering around with to like a more developed stage in terms of using the boxes. That was something that I just sort of randomly and spontaneously started messing around with. And now it's become something that's more serious, not only formally, but like actually conceptually, and has also led to other things that are sort of outside of sculpture. It's actually brought me back to making images again. So that was a kind of surprise as well, of like just, I mean, and you always experience like experiments being more serious than you intend for them to be. But this like surprised me in that I actually see like kind of a long trajectory ahead of me from this point, like of departure. So that was surprising.
I can go if you want. Do you want me?
However you want to do this.
It's up to you.
I'll go. My initial proposal was definitely trying to identify an American experience out in the West. And so the cowboy was kind of my notion of, you know, a mythological character of America, and this identity that is kind of a myth of the United States. And another aspect was labor, how we work in the landscape, how we do things, because I find that really related to art in terms of, as artists, we create things with our hands, which then becomes of the body, which becomes more equated with labor than an intellectual pursuit. So after getting the award, I realized I need to go out there and make sure I have permission to go get. So I immediately left and headed to Wyoming to make sure that I could, you know, follow this family around and kind of be in their way. And so, you know, then that's always kind of a challenge, and, you know, making sure that you're getting permission for everything that you're doing. But the thing that affected me the most through this whole process was I thought I was going out there to film cowboys, and ended up filming cows and buffaloes. And kind of, you know, the history of the landscape, the history of these animals and how they maneuver and how we use them in the landscape. Sorry, I'm a little nervous when I talk. So that was kind of an interesting twist for me in terms of, you know, having these experiences of seeing a birth, which I'd never seen before other than kittens. Nor have I had kids, so I had, you know, no attachment of actually life being reproduced in front of my eyes. Or seeing... So, I mean, there were, you know, moments with the animals that I was not anticipating. And I think that was how it really kind of shifted the project, were these quiet moments of, you know, these buffalo coming up and standing a foot, you know, away from me, you know, and all of a sudden there's this weird interaction and attachment that happens. And so, and also it became too these notions of looking, which I didn't really think about when I first proposed, was how we look when we move through any kind of environment. You know, going up and seeing the buffalo, I kind of felt like the tourist, you know, and so the images kind of became these tourist images, you know, whether you're looking at the roundup or when we went up for the road or for the auction, and all of a sudden all these ranchers are looking at this woman who obviously doesn't belong, because I was freezing and didn't have the right clothes, and I've got this huge camera and they're all like, what is she doing here, you know? And so, you know, it's kind of those experiences that kind of mediated and changed the project and how it was produced. So.
Is this on? I just have to take a quick second to thank Cam and the Gateway Foundation for this
Yes.
amazing opportunity and chance to do this. Thank you to Jeffrey and the whole staff for all the help. Thanks to the jurors for the advice and feedback. I know that the work got to where it is probably because of all that help. I have to thank my wife, too. I was talking with Ann the other day about how she's one of the biggest supporters of art in St. Louis, and maybe inadvertently. So thanks for that. Thanks. The thing, this was a very interesting body of work for me to create, because I really did feel like when we had the studio visits last summer, a lot of the ideas were already there and in place and kind of built on some sort of loose structure. And so when Jeffrey called me, I remember I was at the zoo with my family and told me that I got this, it really felt more like production mode. It's not like I went into tunnel vision and turned off the TV and the internet for a year, but it really allowed me to just kind of produce some of these things that I had already had in my head for a while, which I thought was really great. So looking at my little section of the exhibition now, it feels like it has a lot of the skeleton of what it had last summer. But it's interesting to see over a year the ways that people came in or different ideas came in and kind of just knocked it onto a different path as it grew. Yeah.
And on that note, I'm curious what the jurors think too. I mean, you were here a year ago. You saw their studios a year ago, and in a lot of ways, you made these decisions based on sketches and conversations. And I'm curious what surprised you, if anything, about each of these artists and each of these exhibitions. I mean, you really left it in our hands, so to speak. And I remember hearing your voices sort of in my head as we were going on, when you were like, make sure they look at this, or we'll keep an eye on that, or ask him that. And it was great because it really, really helped guide the show. So I'm curious what surprised you, seeing it in the flesh a year later and seeing the artists again.
Let's see. I don't like that thing. Well, again, I should say that I just think the three artists did an incredible job. I mean, my first reaction was simply, wow, this looks great. And, sometimes when you do a project like this, maybe one artist sort of, hits it out of the park and the others don't quite, maybe measure up, and it can be quite unpredictable. And I really feel like they each made amazing projects. So, and I think we have to give Jeffrey credit for that, Yay, Jeffrey. Because he was really the one working closely with them. And I think that speaks to the value of the kinds of conversations and interactions that happen between curators and artists, especially when you have enough time to really keep a dialogue going. And I think for young artists in particular, and artists who haven't exhibited very widely, it's so crucial to have those opportunities, because if artists only operate in certain realms of the art world, and I think we see this more and more, for example, young artists, maybe they've had 3 or 4 shows in a commercial gallery, but they've never worked with a curator in a museum. And those are very, very different experiences, and I think both are important in an artist's career, but of course, I think working with a curator in a museum is more important. I have my biases that I like to talk about. So, because that really is a dialogue, and the expectations are different, and the motivations are different. So, in terms of what I was surprised about in the artworks themselves, I mean, I think for all of the things we discussed during the visits, and I also think that having 3 jurors makes a big difference, because the conversation inevitably goes deeper. Valerie might bring up a subject I hadn't thought of, or Paul, and we each brought something to it that we couldn't have gotten to singularly. So the complexity of the conversations I felt really good about. But I think what I have enjoyed about seeing the installations is, for everything we discussed at the time and that the artists put forward as things they're thinking through, I think in seeing these projects in person, many more ideas and thoughts and interpretations came forward for me. So I guess I would say that their projects became more complex and more nuanced through the viewing of them in their, final iteration.
Bless you. I would also agree with my esteemed colleague. And I would also say that it is something about seeing the work in space. I mean, when we visited the studios, we visited Tate's home, we visited Lyndon's home. Nanette, we visited your studio, and we were looking at these works in very kind of fixed, limited frames. And to see them in this expanded capacity, I mean, it becomes, as Anne said, it's more complex, it's more experiential. To walk through Tate's, protest barriers and signs and see them at various angles and see words made sculptural in this very beautiful way, and Lyndon to actually walk onto the court and smell the asphaltum. And to see this sort of ambiguous figures that are both represented and absent, present and absent at the same time. And Nanette, to see those 3 screens, 40 hours of shot film edited into these beautiful, you feel as if you're there. And it's something that you didn't get in the studio. And it's phenomenal. And as Anne said, you really walk out with the hope that you've selected people who are ready to take their work to the next level. And again, kudos to Jeffrey and the entire staff for being mentors to the artists and helping them get to this level. As Tate said, the foundation is there, but taking it to the next level does take more than it takes time, it takes resources, and it takes a critical eye and an ear. And so thank you for that, and thank you guys, because not everyone steps through the door when it's open for them, and you guys, sprinted through. And it really shows. I mean, the work is really exceptional, so thank you for allowing us to put our trust in you for that, so. Pass the mic. Don't drop it, though. Don't drop it.
I mean, I feel like you're describing the process so beautifully. To me, I mean, as an artist, I mean, I was going to say I have this unique perspective as an artist, but it's actually true what Valerie just said, that or if it was Anne, just the idea that ultimately exhibitions like this rest so much on the chemistry of a team, and specifically the conversation between an artist and a curator, or artists and curators, who on some level, I mean, we sort of are focused in different ways, but we're equally, I think, concerned with physical production or material production, about how things ultimately look and are experienced in space. It always is such a mystery to me, or just astounding to me, how different something is in one's head as an idea or on paper as a sketch versus how it's experienced when you walk through the door of a museum or look through the window of the museum and see it for the first time, without any wall text. You do get the wall text too, and it unfolds over time, but there's also this first impression, and it's hard to anticipate how an idea will turn into this sort of, unforgiving and just always, it is what it is, the first impression, and then the second impression as you circulate around the space. There's miles between where it starts and that ultimate place, which is kind of like the Holy Grail, is how you experience things in all dimensions, physically and symbolically and psychologically. So, I mean, there's a lot I could say. I just really enjoyed last night. I feel like I went to each of the artists and and had long conversations with them, and it was super gratifying because a lot of what they talked about I could identify with directly in terms of my own experiences. But really, yeah, it's mostly gratifying to see what they came up with, because the first impression and the lasting experience of these projects is really amazing.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, for me, you know, the four of us on this side of the table are not from St. Louis. And what I found so interesting about the Great Rivers Biennial and this process is to really understand place. If change happens on a local level, if we are able to use and understand art and aesthetics to really relate to and respond to a community, then the Great Rivers Biennial for me really did that. I felt like, as a New Yorker who's worked here for 2 years, I understood the region so much more through this practice and through aesthetic culture. And so I was curious about the three artists that are from here. Do you feel like the process and your work gained a new understanding of the Midwest, or how did your understanding of the local and place evolve, if any, over the past year?
Lyndon?
Why don't we start with Lyndon? Because I think it's an important question. I think that when you do a biennial like this that is so specific, you know, you can really, it's an opportunity for us at least, I think is what we were hearing. And so I was curious how that changed or elaborated on for you.
Well, I guess the distinction of being from and being based should be stated, right? Because none of us
Yeah.
are from here necessarily.
That's great.
So I mean, I guess I'm always working from, I mean, Mark said something really great about the present that I like, so I'm always thinking about, you know, where I'm at presently. But this also has like a huge tie to like my experience growing up in different spaces, right? In different urban communities. And, but having said that, I think my idea of, or the idea to put a court in the museum did stem from a very direct relationship to St. Louis and looking at the lack of outdoor courts in certain spaces, namely Forest Park and Tower Grove Park. So that was sort of my way of specifically addressing the city of St. Louis and thinking about, you know, kind of making available the idea of what's possible, you know, of what I felt should be somewhere. But I guess, yeah, I mean, that's how I was responding to place. And then like the other things that sort of, that are taking place on that stage are things that could be, you know, applicable anywhere, I feel like. I feel like that's something that would maybe transcend place for me. But yeah, I mean, the court for sure was definitely something I was thinking about on a very local level and from my experience living here and what I've observed here.
Well, having been born and raised in Seattle, Washington, so being from the West, being here in a place that has a huge arch that's the gateway to the West, and kind of the influence of the Mississippi River, this notion of how when we live somewhere, which way we're looking. So whether you're looking towards the West or, you know, as artists, we're always kind of looking towards New York. So this kind of being positioned in the Midwest, in St. Louis, with all these historical aspects of looking west and moving west and moving west, kind of, and also being from the West and kind of this desire to go back to the West, kind of influences how I develop an understanding and create desires of what interests me. So when I start thinking about the West, it was never about the West Coast. It was always about the mountain region, because that becomes, for me, kind of when we think about the West, that's what we think of. We don't think about, I mean, we definitely think about LA and the Pacific Coast Highway, or Seattle and the Space Needle and the mountains, but really for an identification of this myth of America and manifest destiny and how we have always looked towards the West, it's the mountain region for me that really kind of sets it up. And there's such an integral relationship, or integrated, or I'm not using the right word, but a big relationship between city and rural. And there's a huge dependency between the two. So even though I'm out working in the rural, I'm always thinking about the city and this relationship that is constantly developed between the two. And I think that kind of is how place, because when you're talking about issues of like what was going on with Ferguson, like what do buffaloes and cows have to do with Ferguson, But there is, a lot of the conversation that gets developed about what's going on in the rural is because of these 19th century notions of society and how they're still prevalent in today's society. And so these aspects are still being played out in our communities as we live.
That sounded great. That was really good. I feel like that's a great question. As I was preparing the work for this exhibition, and not even seeing it now, if I didn't live in St. Louis over the last 2 years, this work wouldn't have been produced. And I think that's really interesting to think about when you talk about kind of like what Lyndon said of making work about the place where you are currently. The work at its core is about breaking down language to its most basic parts so that language can start again. And I found myself at many times during last year not having words for conversations post this event. And I teach, and so I found myself going into class and being surrounded by really fired up 18-year-olds that wanted to talk and were ready and eager to talk. And as their instructor and at times their mentor, I found myself like unable to have that ability to say the things that they were ready to hear me say, or that kind of thing. So yeah, I think it took me. Sometimes I look at this work and I'm like, man, it took me long enough to come up with this work, But I think that's really the process that it needed to go through for me to be able to step outside this thing, but also be inside it and look at it from the inside too. So, yeah, thanks, St. Louis.
Well, let's now turn it over to the audience and give you a chance to either ask the jurors or the artists any questions about the work or the process or your own thoughts. There's a hand over there. Do you need my mic? Yeah, please.
Since we're kind of short on mics. Okay, where was the hand?
Simple question to Nanette. I'm from Wyoming, so where exactly did you film the...
Saratoga, Wyoming.
Saratoga. Okay, thank you.
Uh-huh.
Thanks. This question, I guess, is for everyone. There's been several mentions of materials and the relationship between materials and process and concept. I would love to hear more about how the materials evolved, how they affected the concepts that you're dealing with, and anything else you want to share about that.
Nanette?
Thanks.
I'll start. Paybacks. Well, that's actually a really good question. I'll be happy to start that one. So I started off as a landscape painter. And so materials for me has shifted tremendously from getting my graduate work in painting, or doing my graduate work in painting, and it was always, landscapes and trying to create motion in them, and how do you create this experience when you're trucking out there with a 10-foot by 11-foot, canvas, and you're painting it out in the landscape. How do you bring that back so that you can give that to the viewer? Well, none of my paintings ever worked out that way. So they were totally something different. They weren't, what I initially wanted. And it was basically because they didn't move. They were static. And so I eventually started installing videos into my paintings. The videos, this is, I'm dating myself, back in the 90s, and we just had little tiny monitors, the hand TVs, and so I was installing those into the paintings. Problem is when you're across the room and there's a little piece of light and motion that's going on in the painting, your eye goes to that. And so it became an issue of, well, why do we need all this other stuff around it if that's what we're looking at? And so that's how it shifted to video. So then to have an opportunity to do something like this, it's definitely about immersion. It's about putting, giving the viewer this experience that I'm having out in the landscape and make it as monumental in the gallery space as it is for me out in the landscape. So that's the reason why the projections are big, the sound's a little bit, too loud. But it's about you actually physically feeling like you're there. And the images might be a little more dramatic, but then, you physically going out into the landscape, because, when we go out to the landscape, we think, oh, this is going to be beautiful, and it's going to be serene, and there's a lot of wacky stuff that goes on out in the landscape that we don't really think about. And so it's kind of those moments that just kind of jar you out of this notion of what the rural is. And so a video allowed me to do that. And sound.
Lyndon's winking at me. I was telling Alex this the other day, and I think I told the jurors this when they came out last summer. I remember in August or September of 2014 seeing this photo that one of my students had posted on Instagram. All you could see in the photo was plywood and a little sign in the middle of the plywood, like a vinyl metal sign that said, Bill's Plywood Barricading, 24 hours a day, call this number. And I immediately was looking at this really micro thing, and I stepped back and realized that this plywood was pasted up over windows of a business on the north side of St. Louis. And in thinking about this idea that this company was started out of necessity for this thing, was a lot to think about. Actually, kind of said to Alex yesterday that I found myself looking at this photo for 5 minutes, which on Instagram is an eternity, and really trying to take in what that meant. And so the material for me, when thinking about how that came across the concept, it kind of fell into my lap. It really didn't make sense that these panels would be built out of anything other than cheap plywood that I could get my hands on quickly and easily, and these things would look like they were maybe awkwardly constructed, not perfectly well crafted, no right corners, anything, something that was constructed out of haste and necessity rather than, pleasing to the eye or something like that. So that kind of all came together pretty easily for me.
Jeffrey used this term or phrase, transformation of matter, that really sticks with me. So now whenever I'm doing something, I'm like, how is matter being transformed here? But I think but I think it's a really great phrase, and one that that really stuck with me, because I'm always interested in how materials can exist in simultaneous context at once. And so if I can present something and have you recognize what it is, what it's supposed to be used for, but also have it take you elsewhere at the same time, that's where something really electric is happening for me. So whether that's employing a found image that has an original source, but then placing it in a particular way that gets you to think about it in differently. So it's sort of acknowledging these two simultaneous identities at once. And I mean, for me, that's sort of a reflection of my experience in the world as well, as a person, excuse me, who migrates between different social spaces. I've always I found that I've always been drawn to making work that sort of reflects that experience of changing how one performs in different situations. And I feel like my treatment of material always comes back to that same approach. That answers this question.
Any other, Denise?
I know there's also pieces that are in the St. Louis Airport. Could you talk a little bit, for your pieces that are in the St. Louis Airport right now, could you talk a little bit about that installation?
I can keep going. So that work was something that was made very quickly and kind of excitedly and spontaneously as an offshoot of this work, which I spoke earlier about the sculptural work bringing me back to making images, and the paintings that I have in the airport are modified symbols from the toner boxes that are made using toner pigment as the medium. So again, like trying to reference commercial printing in the space of experiencing paintings, so like really bridging these two things. But then also using, the title of the work for that is KM Ultra, which is a play on MK Ultra. So thinking about printing as a way to control or manipulate behavior, and sort of referencing those like unsanctioned experiments in the 50s that were experimenting with LSD and other sorts of like torture methods of like controlling human behavior, getting information out of them. So again, likening like these two different sorts of Paul talked about information, like thinking about the power of information and how that's being used, and sort of likening that or drawing a parallel between that and something that is malicious. Yeah, I mean that's kind of the basis for that project.
Okay. So the piece that I have out at the airport, it's called Sea of Hot Pink Buffalo, and it was kind of a precursor to the work that I'm doing now. My family and I took a family vacation through South Dakota, and we came upon the buffalo, and that's kind of how it all started. And so William Cronin wrote a book about the relationship between Chicago and the immediate west of Chicago with and the rural. And he did a lot of research on just the buffalo, and he has a quote, which I'm not going to quote it well, but basically it talks about the Sea of Buffalo, and that at one time there were around 40 million buffalo from Mexico up to Canada, and that the landscape just undulated with these woolly beasts. And so I was kind of thinking about that notion, is like, I can't even imagine 40 million buffalo. Like, that's just inconceivable for me. So I kind of, thought that's like a sea of buffalo, and so then the fact that it's so unimaginable, I'm like, it has to be pink, or, because, a buffalo you would never associate with pink. And so that's kind of how that piece started, was trying to recreate the unimaginable.
That's really cool. I like that piece. Mine was, I was printing these posters, and so I just decided to print about 50 extra of them, knowing that I'd have all this leftover material for the airport to kind of post up. I can't talk much about it other than I keep checking the geotag every once in a while at Lambert International and see what people are posting. I have quite a few people posting photos of the wall, and I haven't gotten any selfies yet, which is too bad. But the things that they're saying about it, I think, are the most interesting thing. Just that people would stop and look at it long enough to take a photo, which, again, speaking to that idea, is maybe the idea that somebody's actually considering something if they decide to take a photo of it and post it to social media. But it's just been really great to kind of see these comments every once in a while. Every other day, somebody will post a photo of it and say something stupid. Like this is cool or something, and then it says like nationhood right behind them, It's like, oh, good.
I guess we should also say that, so that works in the Southwest terminal after security. So you have to be flying Southwest in order to see it, unfortunately. But
Maybe one more question? Is there one more question? Oh, one more over here.
nice.
Thank you. This question is for Nanette. You mentioned Manifest Destiny and Ferguson. So I just kind of want you to expand on how you feel those two things are related, this idea of like an agrarian kind of ideal, and how that you feel that's related to like contemporary like civil unrest.
Well, we could be here all day. That's a big question. I think wow, how to approach that? Well, we live in a white supremacist society, just through our culture, attitudes, notions. Those notions and attitudes have continued from Europe to United States, from 16th century to present date, and although they have changed, but they remanifest themselves. And so there is, not to get too political, but frickin' Trump, I mean, how does that even happen? These things keep cropping up, and you just kind of think, why are we not learning? Why are we not getting this? And so that's kind of, me going and, kind of identifying these notions of how we've developed our society through these myths and these understandings of these identities. We really have to break them down and look at them, because there's a disconnect between these ideals and what is real. And that's how I feel like I go in and kind of really kind of show that, I mean, the landscape's not the way the landscape is. This whole notion of moving west and westward expansion is, totally different than, we need to be kind of bringing that back home and addressing what's happening here in our society. And so it's kind of like showing where we, like these ideals that have been developed in our country and our government and how we present ourselves is like, this isn't, it's who we are, but it's not who we are. Like there's nothing better than diversity and people living differently. And my concern is that we're all gonna be living the same way, And so I think that's where my passion and my love kind of plays out and kind of addresses issues that may not, because of me being a white woman in society, I have the position to actually speak to. So I'm playing kind of on the outside and fighting for what should be on the inside.
I guess thinking about like western expansion and like Manifest Destiny in particular too, it's like that's like a very that excluded indigenous people, like that notion. I guess I guess I was just failing to make the connection between holding the rural like above like the urban, which I think those Manifest Destinies about that too. These ideals and agrarian ideals about that. I don't know, I guess like when that got brought up, I just couldn't make the connection between contemporary urban, like corrupt institutions and like romanticizing the West. So that was actually what I was asking about.
Did I answer the question, or am I so far left of, or right?
Great. Well, if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank the jurors again for your incredible work. I'd like to thank the artists for your incredible work. Thank you all for joining us. And we'll see you